You want to today procedural questions about what might occur at the hearing on March 14th. And I also do feel that the committee had received a letter, an additional letter from the Wabanaki Tribal Public Health HMP, and I did want to acknowledge that the committee had received that letter, and so we'll leave that open for the committee's discretion on what they would like to do.
And that letter is not in our packet, as I recall.
But
and if you could hand that out, I think that would be good. But she's going to hand it out. We didn't have it. So I think we'll get that handed out. But let's first take up the question around the 14th. Just from informal discussion with committee members, I think there's been a lot of question around how the 14th will work with the number of people. Just up front, I think it's clear we're looking at a situation where questions would only come from the committee, not from any other parties as part of our hearing. I think that's one thing that that in the statute is addressed, that the chair has the ability to have other people question. We're the Government Oversight Committee. We'll be dealing with that. And I have had a request. Yes, go ahead, Reverend Davis.
Are you suggesting that the whole committee asks questions, or just the chairs and the leads, as I was led to believe was going to be the understanding?
Thank you. So we haven't had a conversation about that on mic here. I was going to say another element that has come forward that I'm particularly comfortable with from a planning perspective is that there's been a request that the chairs and leads are the ones who will ask the questions of the people who come before us. And then what I would add to that is I want to make sure that if questions arise that aren't answered during that Q&A, that other committee members have the opportunity to send those questions through the chairs and leads to be considered. I just want to make sure we don't send a message to other committee members that if they have something that they think needs to be asked that hasn't been asked, that there's a time allotted at the end of each of those interviews for them to have those questions. And I would actually say the same for our staff, for Director Ashcroft, if there are questions that she thinks we need to move ahead with, that she submit those to as well. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thinking about that and having given a little bit of thought in the last few days, personally, I wouldn't object to a follow-up question or two by the other members of the committee. I don't want to prolong it. We don't need to ask 20 questions, but one or maybe two questions. I guess I'd also like to hear from the rest of the committee as to what they would think of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Others who want to weigh in about the questioning? Yes, Senator Youngblood.
I think it's a very good idea that at the end, if there are some things that some of us feel ought to be asked, that we can write the question down and send it to the chairs or the leads to ask that question. But I think it ought to go through those four people.
Other comments about that, or concerns, questions, objections, support? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a little hesitant about that just because I guess you'll have to do a lot of writing, scribbling thoughts and figure out which ones are answered and send you the right notes when things are done in order to get questions asked. I mean, if it's a particular concern of other members, I'm certainly willing to make it work that way. It just seems a bit stifling.
I think we want to make sure stifling is not what happened. So I think one of the things I would suggest is that if we have initial questions, which I believe would be prepared, I would assume in advance by the chairs and leads in conjunction with caucus members in preparation for the 14th, we would be able to go through those. And then I think it would be reasonable to have just a window of time afterwards where we say, okay, give committee members a few minutes to digest so you don't have to scribble, because if you do pass me a question, Senator Johnson, I'd like to be able to read your handwriting. And I don't want you to be rushed. So I think we'll make sure there's adequate time and consideration for committee members. But I think in advance of the 14th, it's important for all of us to sit down on our own, or within our caucuses or colleagues, to read through that report and go and review those questions that we want to have answered, and make sure we do prep work. It's not the kind of meeting we can just show up to and do off the cuff. It's important, I think, on behalf of the people that we've invited to come here, that we are well prepared for the specific questions within the scope of the report. Yes, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think to make sure that we keep in mind the scope of the inquiry, to have a note on what that scope is from the chairs that we can also be considering when we're working on those questions. It would be helpful too.
Sure. Absolutely. Yes, Representative Boland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I kind of share Senator Johnson's sense that it does feel a little stifling, but I would think that if we knew what the questions are going to be and everybody was in support and we knew to keep things to a minimum, that would, I don't know, that make me feel a little better. But that, I know it has to move quickly, and that's important. I hate to think of committee members not
Sure.
having an opportunity to.
Well, at the prior meeting, I will say, and I'm going to look for the piece of paper, I actually articulated publicly the scope of what we were doing here. And I am hesitant to have us prepare questions in writing in advance. I don't think that's really in our best interest. It doesn't allow for as much opportunity for back and forth. We'll do some prep, but I think in the way of preparing questions for everyone to review doesn't allow for what may or may not come forward as information. So I think if we can be reminded of that scope, and it's probably in the minutes. Dr. Ashton, you're probably looking for it right now. Great, you can tell us where we find it in the minutes.
Sure.
Then I think we can all be on the same page about what it is we're seeking to determine.
I think if you would turn to page 6 of your minutes from the prior meeting. Second block paragraph from the top. It is kind of a lengthy paragraph, but down past the middle, the scope of the review would be to further obtain information that was contained in and issues and concerns arising from OPEGA's Healthy Maine Partnership's fiscal year 13 projects and funding report in relation to the Maine CDC's decision to change the structure for the delivery and funding of the HMPs, the process used and decisions made in selecting the lead HMPs, and the maintenance of documentation supporting that effort. And those are the areas that were outlined in the subpoena for the individuals that were subpoenaed.
Hopefully that's helpful to members. Other comments or questions about that meeting? We do have in our books under, I believe, tab 5, the various statutes that we are under. The Legislative Investigating Committee, Public Records and Proceedings, as well as our own statute as OPEGA. Are there any questions about that, particularly when we have Linda here? Any other questions at all from the committee? Or yes, Representative Davis.
Thank you. I'm presuming this is going to be an executive session.
No, that is not presumed.
It is not going to be.
It is not, wouldn't typically be. And we have not received a request for that at this point. And then we would have as a committee the ability to make that decision about whether or not that would be appropriate and whether or not that would be actually helpful to the scope of our inquiry. Yes, Representative Cotta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is the history, as this is my first on this committee, of using executive session? I mean, have they in the past, or?
Executive sessions, and Linda can speak to this fluently, under the Freedom of Access Act, the ability to have an executive session is limited to only particular topic areas. We have been working with the Attorney General's office to understand how that freedom of access law relates to the provisions that are specifically in the investigating committee statute that speak to executive session. So this committee's use of executive session in the past has been very limited because FOIA does not allow for there to be an executive session around just anything. I think maybe we've done it twice for different reasons. And the only other time that the committee's taken this step with subpoenas and testimony under oath was with the Maine Turnpike Authority. Executive sessions were not requested and were not provided in that instance.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there any other procedural questions about the meeting on the 14th?
I also want to mention the subpoenas also did require those individuals to produce any records that they had related to the criteria or descriptions and discussions of the criteria, as well as the scoring and the scoring methodology that they had not already directly provided to OPEGA. We did have some individuals who had already given us directly from them to us some information, and we don't expect them to reproduce those records. But for those that might have records that did not come to us directly from them, we did request that they also produce those at the meeting.
Yes, Senator Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Beth, it might be helpful if we could maybe, the subpoenas identical to each of the witnesses?
With one exception, the subpoena for Sharon Leahy Lind acknowledges that she may be reimbursed for her travel under this statute. But yes.
Sure. If you could just send us perhaps a copy of one of those subpoenas since they're identical otherwise, so we can see the scope of what they were asked to bring, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Any other requests or questions? So questioning will be done that day by the chairs and the leads. We'll make sure there's adequate time and consideration for other committee members to bring forward questions. We will, and staff as well. And otherwise, prior to that point, I think chairs and leads will probably work together with Director Ashcroft to make sure we're ready for that day so it goes smoothly and professionally. Yes, Senator Johnson.
A bit of an aside, but it seems odd to me that the wording of much of this statute, it refers to male pronoun only. His counsel.
I'm sure it's in the most generic sense.
Etc.
It's a fairly old
Quite old,
statute.
Quite old statute.
Which raises an interesting point. We discussed last time we got into this position whether it might not be worth taking what was relevant to a government oversight committee investigation and weaving that into the OPEGA statute so that it was clear for the committee without having to do all these crosswalks between statutes. It raises itself again.
Yes, certainly that could be a project for the committee at some point in our free time. It sounds like a good thing for an errors bill to fix the pronouns in the statute. Any other questions before we move on to the next agenda item? Within this work session, we still have the letter from the Wabanaki Public Health. It's been handed out to you.